Most students plan their essays on ignorance and social responsibility in A Christmas Carol like this. Scrooge is described as being deeply selfish at the start of the novella. The ghosts teach him lessons. At the end of the novella, he becomes kind and generous to all. These ideas are relevant, but they're still too simplistic to reach grade 9. To reach grade 9, you need to track how Dickens presents ignorance and social responsibility across the novella. Initially, Dickens presents the rejection of social responsibility as emotionally and morally destructive to the individual, suggesting that selfishness isolates individuals from humanity itself. This is clear in Stave 1, when Scrooge is described as solitary as an oyster. The simile immediately presents Scrooge as emotionally closed off and disconnected from the people around him in society. Like the shell of an oyster, he protects himself from human connection and responsibility. Dickens deliberately presents selfishness as a form of imprisonment. The adjective solitary carries connotations of loneliness and isolation, which Victorian readers may have associated with punishment and suffering. This suggests that rejecting social responsibility ultimately damages the individual as much as the people around them. Importantly, Dickens frequently dehumanizes Scrooge throughout the opening stave, presenting him more like a creature than a normal human being. This reflects how greed and emotional detachment strip away compassion and humanity. However, the image of the oyster is more complex than it first appears. Oysters can contain pearls inside them, perhaps foreshadowing that there is still goodness hidden within Scrooge despite his cold exterior. This subtly reinforces Dickens' belief that redemption is still possible, even for people who have isolated themselves from society. The description also links to the later image of Scrooge as a solitary child, suggesting that emotional neglect and isolation can shape a person's entire worldview. In this way, Dickens initially presents social irresponsibility as both personally destructive and socially damaging. However, Dickens later presents ignorance as the greatest threat to society throughout industrial Britain. This is most evident in Stave 3, when the ghost of Christmas Present reveals that "This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, for on his brow I see that written which is doom." Dickens uses allegory to transform social problems into physical figures, making poverty and neglect impossible for both Scrooge and the reader to ignore. The noun ignorance suggests not only a lack of education, but also society's deliberate refusal to acknowledge suffering. Similarly, want represents both poverty and desperate human need, reinforcing the cycle of deprivation experienced by the poor in Victorian Britain. The repeated imperative "beware" creates urgency and functions almost like a direct warning to the audience. Dickens is no longer simply telling a ghost story, he is demanding social responsibility. The biblical connotations of the noun doom elevate the warning to a serious moral and spiritual level for the reader, implying that a society which ignores suffering risks destruction and judgment. Importantly, Dickens states that doom is written specifically upon the brow of ignorance. The symbolism of the brow, associated with thought and identity, suggests that ignorance is society's most dangerous failure because it allows suffering to continue unchecked. For Victorian readers, this warning would have reflected growing fears surrounding poverty, inequality, and possible social unrest in Britain. Dickens strongly supported educational reform and believed society had a moral duty to care for vulnerable people, rather than simply blaming them for their suffering and the impoverished conditions they live in. In this way, Dickens presents ignorance not simply as a personal flaw, but as a national moral failure. Ultimately, Dickens presents social responsibility as essential for both personal redemption and the protection of society's most vulnerable people. This is clear at the end of the novella, when Dickens states that to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. The relative clause, who did not die, emphasizes that Scrooge's transformation has directly saved Tiny Tim's life. Dickens therefore presents redemption not as words or intentions, but as meaningful action. The phrase "second father" is especially significant because it suggests that Scrooge has finally accepted emotional responsibility for another human being. This creates a powerful contrast with the isolated figure introduced at the beginning of the novella. Scrooge no longer separates himself from society, but instead becomes part of a loving and supportive community. The ending follows a circular structure because Scrooge returns to many of the same people from stave 1. However, his behavior has completely changed, reinforcing Dickens' belief that individuals are capable of moral transformation. Importantly, Scrooge becomes a father figure despite his own traumatic and lonely childhood. Dickens suggests that people are not permanently trapped by their past experiences and can still choose kindness, compassion, and generosity. Dickens also presents social responsibility as something that must be actively practiced. Scrooge does not simply feel guilty, he changes his behavior and improves the lives of others. By ending the novella with Tiny Tim's survival, Dickens leaves the reader with a hopeful message that society itself can improve if people choose empathy over selfishness. Dickens ultimately presents ignorance and social irresponsibility as the greatest dangers facing Victorian society. Throughout the novella, selfishness causes emotional isolation, suffering, and inequality, while compassion and responsibility create human connection and redemption. The transformation of Scrooge from a solitary figure into a second father symbolizes Dickens' belief that people can morally change if they reject selfishness and accept responsibility for others. Importantly, Dickens does not simply criticize individuals. Through the allegorical figures of ignorance and want, he condemns an entire society that allows poverty and suffering to continue through indifference. For Victorian readers, this would have acted as both a Christian moral lesson and a political warning about the consequences of neglecting the poor. Dickens believed education, empathy, and generosity were essential if society wished to avoid division, suffering, and social collapse. In this way, A Christmas Carol becomes far more than a festive ghost story. Dickens transforms the novella into a powerful argument for compassion, social reform, and collective responsibility. Subscribe to GCSE LitVerse for more Grade 9 English Literature revision. Like the video if this helped you.